Right, welcome to Underground Science, and in this video, we're going to be covering systemic circulation of the heart. Alright, so if you guys remember, the last video that I made was on the pulmonary circulation of the heart, and if you guys haven't watched that yet, I would strongly suggest you guys do, because systemic circulation is a continuation of pulmonary circulation. Alright, so last video I talked about how pulmonary circulation occurred at the right side of the heart and in the lungs. And now we're going to be talking about the left side of the heart, which is going to be systemic circulation. Right, so before we begin, let's write some of the structures down that are going to be involved in systemic circulation. All right, so first thing that comes to my mind is the left side of the heart. All right, so left side of the heart. All right, so this is going to be one of the main components in pulmonary circulation. Okay, and a second structure is going to be the aorta and the three branches that come off the aorta. All right, hopefully if you guys watch my structures video of the heart, you guys should know what the three branches are called because we went over it. But I'll go ahead and label it for you guys in this video also, so it's more clear to understand the systemic circulation. Three branches off the aorta. All right, but mainly it's going to be the left side of the heart that's going to pump that oxygenated blood that we got from pulmonary circulation, and we're going to pump that oxygenated blood to the rest of the body. All right, so that's basically it, and let's go ahead and get started. All right, so this is just going to be a quick overview of where we ended the last video at, which was the pulmonary circulation. So remember, pulmonary circulation involved the right side of the heart, right? So the inferior vena cava, the superior vena cava, the right atrium, right? That's not a good color. The right atrium, the right ventricle, the pulmonary arteries of the heart, which is the left one and the right one, and then the pulmonary arteries. Remember, we talked about in the last video how the pulmonary arteries branch in to arterioles, which are even smaller blood vessels than arteries, and then even smaller blood vessels, which are going to be the capillaries, right? The arterioles are going to branch into capillaries near the lungs so that oxygen and carbon dioxide diffusion can be much easier and more efficient. And notice that I wrote it in blue, all of this, because remember, this will all start from the pulmonary artery, right? All these blood vessel branching, and the pulmonary artery, remember, is carrying the deoxygenated blood that was just pumped from the right ventricle. All right, but however, when the capillaries get their oxygen from the alveoli, they're going to turn into venules. All right, and if you recognize venules, you can see the word vein in it, right? It's not spelled in it, but it sounds familiar, right? Veins are blood vessels that bring blood to the heart, and that's why venules will bring the oxygenated blood now to the left atrium where systemic circulation can begin. All right, it's going to bring the oxygenated blood through the pulmonary veins of the heart and into the left atrium, right, where systemic circulation can begin, and that's the topic of this video. All right, so, I forgot to label it down here, but again, this is in the last video, so if you guys haven't watched that yet, I'll suggest you guys watch it, so it's going to be much more easier to understand systemic circulation. So this is the capillary, right, that we talked about, had deoxygenated blood in it, and then thanks to our alveolus, right, we had oxygen diffuse in, making the blood oxygenated, while CO2 in the blood diffused out and into the alveoli, which you exhaled out. And then now, since the capillary is oxygenated, it turned into a venule, and this venule took that oxygenated blood back into the left side of the heart, right, in particular the left atrium, and it took that oxygenated blood through the pulmonary veins of the heart. Okay, so now let's begin the systemic circulation of the heart. All right, so here we see that same picture of the heart as we saw in the previous slide. But right now, we're going to start talking about the left side of the heart, okay? Because we're done with the right side of the heart. That was pulmonary circulation. All right, so we just said that the blood, the oxygenated blood, ended up in the left atrium. All right, so this is full of oxygenated blood, right? Ready to get pumped out into the body. All right, but first, we have to see what happens next, okay? Because it's in the left atrium right now, but next it's going to get pumped, right? The left atrium, the myocardium around the left atrium is going to be responsible for generating that force so that the left atrium can pump that oxygenated blood into the left ventricle. All right, so now the oxygenated blood that was in the left atrium got pumped into the left ventricle via this mitral valve, right? So remember, this is called the mitral valve, and it's also called the bicuspid valve. All right, so now the oxygenated blood is in the left ventricle, okay? And we're going to label steps here, and then we're going to write it down in another page, okay? So we're going to label this as step 1. All right, so step 1 we just said was that the left atrium of the heart will pump that oxygenated blood, will pump oxygenated blood into the left ventricle, right? This is the last chamber of the heart, and it's going to pump it through the mitral valve. All right, mitral valve, also called the bicuspid valve. All right, that's awesome. So now the oxygenated blood is in the left ventricle, and it's getting ready to pump that oxygenated blood, right? The left ventricle is getting ready to pump that oxygenated blood through the aortic valve and through the aorta and out to the body. All right, so now step 2 is going to be the left ventricle, all right, guys, is going to generate enough force, right? Think about this. The left ventricle has to generate enough force and has to pump at a high enough pressure so that the whole body is going to receive blood, all right, oxygenated blood, right? That means it has to pump at a much higher force, right? So it's going to generate a lot of pressure as it pumps. It's going to have to pump at a higher pressure than you would expect, and it's actually going to pump, a little fun fact like we did in the last video. So actually, let's do it for comparison purposes. So last video, remember we said that when the right ventricle pumps the deoxygenated blood into the pulmonary arteries, it's going to pump at about 20 to 25 millimeters of mercury, right? Remember that? So when the right ventricle pumps, it's going to pump at about 20 to 25 millimeters of mercury. All right, so keep in mind that's the right ventricle. And remember, the right ventricle, it just has to generate enough force to pump that deoxygenated blood near the lungs so that the deoxygenated blood can get oxygenated. All right, and the heart and lungs are really close to each other, right? So that's why the right ventricle only has to pump at about 20 to 25 millimeters of mercury of pressure in order to get that deoxygenated blood to the lungs. Okay, but the left ventricle, right, on the other hand, so let's write this down. This is pretty cool, actually. The left ventricle has to pump much harder, okay, because it has to pump, again, that oxygenated blood throughout the whole body, all right? It has to have enough pressure so that that oxygenated blood reaches the whole body, right? Every cell in your body, it's going to travel down your arteries, your arterioles, your capillaries, and then finally it's going to come back, right, by your venules and veins and then back into the right side of the heart. But it has to generate so much force, and the pressure at which the left ventricle is going to pump, it's going to be around 120 millimeters of mercury. All right, you guys can just see right off the bat that the left ventricle pumps at a much higher pressure than the right ventricle does. Okay, and that's actually the 120 millimeters of mercury is actually your systolic blood pressure reading, right? This is your systolic blood pressure. Oops. Blood pressure with a P, right? Systolic blood pressure in your blood pressure reading. So like if you go to the doctor and you see you have a blood pressure of 120/80, So your top number is your systolic number, all right, and your bottom number is your diastolic number. Okay, so systolic number of 120 millimeters of mercury, that's the pressure at which your left ventricle is going to pump. Okay, that's the top number of your blood pressure. And the bottom number, the diastolic number, means that the pressure at which your ventricles relax is going to be 80 millimeters of mercury. All right, what do I mean by that? When your ventricles relax, remember it's going to fill with blood after the ventricles pump. The atria are going to send that blood down that the atria are holding into the ventricles. And those ventricles, that's diastole. That's the relaxing time of the ventricles. Okay, so when the ventricles contract, let me write this down. When the ventricles of the heart, when the ventricles contract, that's going to be called systole. Okay, this is called systole when the ventricles contract. Okay, when they send their blood out. Right, so if the right ventricle contracts, it's going to send its blood out through the pulmonary arteries, and when the left ventricle contracts, it's going to send its blood out through the aorta into the rest of the body. Okay, so again, when the left ventricles contract, they're in systole. Okay, and when the ventricles of the heart relax, meaning when they're filling with blood and getting ready to contract again, that's called diastole. Okay, so when the ventricles are relaxing, right, and filling with blood, right, that the atria are pumping down into the ventricles, that's going to be called diastole. That's when the ventricles are relaxing, ready to contract again. Okay, and so the same concept applies here. The pressure at which these ventricles are relaxing is your bottom number in your blood pressure reading. Okay, so in this case, your left ventricle will pump at about 120 millimeters of mercury. Okay, that's your systolic number. And the pressure at which your ventricles relax and fill with blood is going to be 80 millimeters of mercury. Okay, so that makes up 120 over 80. All right, that's just a side fact, right? Just to compare how much harder the left ventricle pumps than the right ventricle. All right, so back to systemic circulation. So we just said the left ventricle will pump its blood, right, from the left ventricle through this aortic valve, all right, and it's going to pump it through the aortic arc and the aorta and out these three branches into the rest of the body. All right, so again, this was already said in the structures video, right? We went over this in the structures video of the heart, but let me just label it again just to refresh our memories. All right, so 1, 2, and 3. And let me write it down for you guys right here at the bottom so it's more clear. So 1, right, so this branch of the aorta is called the left subclavian artery, all right, and 2, so the middle branch of the aorta is going to be called the left common carotid artery. All right, and last but not least, the first branch off the aorta that we see here, so 3, is going to be called the brachiocephalic trunk, okay, or the brachiocephalic artery, right, whichever one's fine. Okay, so that's pretty much it for systemic circulation. All right, all systemic circulation is, right, let's go write that actually down since we're pretty much done now. So all systemic circulation was, right, so systemic circulation is pretty much when the left side of heart pumps, in particular we're talking about, right, the left ventricle is going to actually pump that oxygen blood throughout the body, but overall the left side of the heart is working together to pump that oxygenated blood throughout the body. Right, so left side of the heart pumps oxygenated blood throughout the body. Right, so that's systemic circulation throughout the body. And guys, this process will repeat itself over and over, right? So when the left ventricle pumps the oxygenated blood throughout the body, right, it's going to go out of these branches of the aorta, right, into the rest of the body, and it's going to branch into smaller and smaller blood vessels, right? So it's going to start off as arteries, then go to arterioles and capillaries and venules, right? That's going to make up the capillary bed. Your nutrients and oxygen are going to go to your tissues and cells, and then once the oxygen is delivered, your blood will become deoxygenated again. So it's going to turn into venules and veins, and it's going to come back. And again, like we talked in pulmonary circulation, the veins are going to come back with that deoxygenated blood and dump that blood into the superior and inferior vena cava and into the right atrium. And that whole process will start again, right? Pulmonary circulation, getting that deoxygenated blood oxygenated via the lungs, and then getting that oxygenated blood to the left side of the heart, and that way the left side of the heart will pump that oxygenated blood throughout the rest of the body, and that process will repeat itself over and over. Okay, so that's systemic circulation, and in the next video I'm going to be actually talking about two things. Okay, so if you guys watched my last video on pulmonary circulation and this video, which is systemic circulation, I bet you guys noticed one thing, that I'm trying to explain it one chamber by one chamber, right, of the heart. So I said first, right, the deoxygenated blood is going to come into the right atrium, and then it's going to contract and send that blood to the right ventricle, and then the right ventricle is going to pump it through the pulmonary arteries, and on and on and on, right? I said it one at a time. I said it as if blood was going from one chamber to the next chamber while the left side is waiting, right? But that's not reality. In reality, both sides of the heart are pumping at the same time. So when the right atrium pumps its deoxygenated blood into the right ventricle, at that same time, the left atrium will also pump its oxygenated blood into the left ventricle. All right, so everything's happening simultaneously. Okay, it's not one at a time, or else we would die if that happened, right? If the left side of the heart was waiting for the right side of the heart, right, to one by one go one chamber by one chamber, right, we would run out of oxygen. So everything's happening at the same time, and I'm going to talk about in specific, how both sides of the heart, the right side and the left side, work together, like they pump at the same time and when they pump. And I'm also going to be talking about why the valves are so important in preventing regurgitation and how they prevent regurgitation when the heart pumps. All right, so I really hope to see you guys there in my next video. All right, so see ya.